Have you ever stopped and wondered why billions of people willingly pour hot leaf water into a cup every single day? Think about it. Humans have invented airplanes, computers, and robots that can vacuum the floor, yet somehow one of our favorite drinks is still just leaves in hot water. And not just a few people. Every day, billions of cups of tea are consumed around the world. That's enough tea to make your kettle file a complaint with human resources. But tea isn't just a drink. This tiny leaf has started wars, built fortunes, created global trade networks, inspired elaborate ceremonies, fueled empires, and even helped spark a revolution. At one point, governments taxed it. Smugglers risked their lives for it. And entire ships raced across oceans carrying nothing but boxes full of dried leaves. So how did a wild plant growing in ancient China become the second most consumed drink on Earth after water? Who discovered it? Why did emperors love it? Why did Britain become obsessed with it? And how did one simple leaf end up changing world history? Grab a cup of tea, or don't, we're not here to judge, and let's travel back nearly 5,000 years to uncover the incredible story of humanity's favorite leaf. According to legend, the story of tea began around 5,000 years ago with a Chinese emperor named Shen Nong. Now, Shen Nong wasn't just any emperor. Legend says he was a scholar, a scientist, a farmer, and apparently someone who took boiling water very seriously. He encouraged people to boil their water before drinking it, which was actually a pretty smart idea, considering ancient bacteria hadn't yet invented customer service. One day, while traveling through the countryside, Shen Nong's servants were boiling water for him. Then, nature decided to become a beverage inventor. A few leaves from a nearby wild tea plant drifted through the air and landed right into the pot. Instead of panicking and demanding a refund, Shen Nong noticed a pleasant aroma rising from the water. Curious, he took a sip. The taste was refreshing, energizing, and unlike anything he had experienced before. And just like that, according to the legend, tea was born. Now, did this event actually happen exactly this way? Nobody knows. The story was written down centuries later, so historians aren't entirely convinced that a random leaf performed the greatest cannonball in beverage history. But what we do know is that tea really did originate in ancient China. The earliest tea plants grew naturally in the mountainous regions of southwestern China, and people were using tea long before it became a popular drink. In fact, early tea wasn't treated like a relaxing afternoon beverage. It was often used as medicine. People believed it could improve health, aid digestion, increase alertness, and help the body function better. So the first tea drinkers weren't saying, let's have a cozy tea break. They were basically saying, Doctor, I'll take 1 cup of leaf soup, please. What started as a medicinal plant would eventually become one of the most important drinks in human history. For centuries after its discovery, tea remained mostly a local Chinese tradition. But then, something remarkable happened. People didn't just like tea, they became completely obsessed with it. During the Tang Dynasty, which began in the 7th century, tea exploded in popularity across China. What started as a medicinal drink was rapidly transforming into an everyday habit. Farmers drank it, merchants drank it, scholars drank it, government officials drank it. At this point, tea was basically achieving celebrity status. Tea farms expanded across the countryside, and merchants carried tea along trade routes to cities throughout the empire. Soon, tea houses began appearing everywhere. Think of them as the ancient version of coffee shops. People gathered there to relax, chat, conduct business, exchange gossip, listen to music, and occasionally pretend they weren't eavesdropping on the table next to them. Tea was no longer just a drink. It was becoming part of Chinese culture itself. And as tea became more important, people started taking it very seriously. Different regions produced different flavors, different brewing methods appeared. Experts debated which tea was best. In other words, ancient China invented tea enthusiasts.
Some people became so passionate that they dedicated their lives to studying tea. One of them was a scholar named Lu Yu. Around the 8th century, he wrote a book called The Classic of Tea. Yes, tea became so important that it got its own instruction manual. The book explained how tea should be grown, prepared, served, and appreciated. Imagine writing an entire encyclopedia about your favorite drink. Actually, don't imagine it. Someone already did. By the end of the Tang Dynasty, tea had become much more than a beverage. It was an art form, a social activity, a business, and for millions of people, a daily ritual they couldn't imagine living without. China hadn't just discovered tea, it had created tea culture.
Tea was now spreading across China, but it wasn't staying there. Thanks to merchants, travelers, and wandering monks, tea was about to begin one of the most successful world tours in history. One group in particular played a huge role: Buddhist monks. Monks often spent long hours studying, meditating, and praying. The problem? Humans have been falling asleep during important activities for thousands of years. Tea turned out to be the perfect solution. It helped monks stay alert during long periods of meditation and study without turning them into hyperactive chaos machines. As Buddhist teachings spread beyond China, monks carried tea with them. And wherever they went, tea often followed. One of the most important stops on tea's journey was Japan. Around the 8th and 9th centuries, Japanese monks visiting China encountered tea and brought both tea seeds and tea drinking traditions back home. At first, tea was mostly enjoyed by monks and nobles, but over time, it spread throughout Japanese society. The Japanese didn't simply copy Chinese tea culture. They transformed it into something uniquely their own. Tea preparation became highly refined. Every movement mattered. Every gesture had meaning. Even making a cup of tea became a carefully practiced art. Imagine spending years mastering the skill of making a beverage while modern humans struggle to operate a coffee machine before breakfast. Tea also spread to Korea and other parts of East Asia. Different regions developed their own traditions, brewing styles, and favorite varieties. The amazing thing is that everyone started with the same little leaf, yet each culture created something different from it. By this point, tea was no longer just China's favorite drink. It was becoming an international superstar, and its journey around the world was only getting started. By the time tea reached Europe, it had already spent thousands of years conquering Asia. But Europe had absolutely no idea what it was about to get addicted to. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Portuguese and Dutch traders began bringing tea from Asia back to Europe. For many Europeans, tea seemed mysterious. It came from distant lands, it was expensive, and nobody was entirely sure whether it was a drink, a medicine, or some kind of magical leaf-based wizard potion. At first, only the wealthy could afford it. Kings drank it, queens drank it, nobles drank it. Meanwhile, ordinary people looked at tea prices and thought, maybe I'll just drink water. Tea quickly became a status symbol. If you served tea to guests, you weren't just offering a drink. You were basically announcing, look how rich I am. Fancy tea sets appeared. Elegant tea parties became fashionable. European merchants rushed to import more tea to satisfy growing demand. Soon, tea was arriving on ships from Asia in enormous quantities. And the more people drank it, the more they wanted it. Europe had discovered a new obsession. Merchants made fortunes. Trading companies expanded their influence across oceans. Entire business empires began growing around a beverage made from dried leaves. It's actually impressive when you think about it. Human history contains countless examples of people crossing dangerous oceans, facing storms, pirates, and shipwrecks, all because they really wanted another cup of tea. What began as a Chinese tradition was now becoming a global phenomenon. And among all the European countries falling in love with tea, one nation was about to take that obsession to an entirely different level: Britain. If Europe liked tea, Britain absolutely fell in love with it. And by fell in love, I mean developed the kind of obsession usually reserved for sports teams, celebrities, or cat videos. Tea first arrived in Britain during the 17th century. At first, it was a luxury enjoyed mainly by the wealthy. But as imports increased and prices gradually fell, tea spread through every level of society. Rich or poor, farmer or factory worker, merchant or politician, everyone wanted tea. By the 18th century, Britain was drinking astonishing amounts of it. A cup of tea became part of daily life. People drank it in the morning, they drank it in the afternoon, they drank it while working, they drank it while relaxing. At some point, Britain basically looked at the clock and decided every hour was tea time. One tradition became especially famous: afternoon tea. In the 1840s, people began gathering between lunch and dinner for tea, snacks, and conversation. What started as a simple habit evolved into a cultural institution. Tea wasn't just a beverage anymore. It was an event, a ceremony, a national pastime. Demand for tea grew so rapidly that Britain needed enormous quantities from overseas. Ships constantly crossed oceans carrying tea cargo. Trading companies expanded, ports became busier, and global trade networks stretched across continents. Behind every British teacup stood farmers, merchants, sailors, dock workers, and traders spread across the world. It's amazing when you think about it. Millions of people working together just so someone could sit comfortably and say, "Lovely weather. Fancy a cup of tea?" By now, tea had become deeply woven into British identity, and that growing obsession was about to create a new problem. The government noticed just how much tea everyone was drinking, and governments throughout history tend to have a very predictable reaction when they notice people love something. They tax it. The British government had discovered something very important. People really, really loved tea. And if history teaches us anything, it's that governments often look at popular things and think, that seems taxable. So taxes on tea began rising, and rising, and rising some more. Eventually, tea became so heavily taxed that its price skyrocketed. For many ordinary people, legal tea became painfully expensive. But there was one small problem with the government's plan. People weren't about to give up their favorite drink. Instead, they got creative. Very creative. A massive tea smuggling industry emerged across Britain. Under the cover of darkness, smugglers secretly transported tea into the country, avoiding government taxes. Entire coastal communities became involved. Fishermen, merchants, sailors, and local residents often worked together to move illegal tea from ships to towns before customs officers could catch them. Some smuggling gangs became surprisingly organized. They had networks, secret routes, lookout systems, and enough planning to make modern crime movies jealous. At times, more tea entered Britain illegally than legally. Think about that. An entire underground economy built around people's refusal to stop drinking hot leaf water. And then things became even stranger. Because tea was expensive, dishonest sellers started creating fake tea. Some mixed genuine tea leaves with random plants. Others reused old leaves and dyed them to look fresh. A few mixtures were so questionable that customers were probably drinking something that had never met a tea plant in its life. Imagine ordering tea and receiving what was essentially mystery salad water. Eventually, the government realized the taxes were encouraging smuggling instead of stopping it. So in the late 18th century, tea taxes were dramatically reduced. Legal tea became more affordable, smuggling declined, and Britain's tea addiction continued uninterrupted. But while Britain was struggling with smugglers and taxes, trouble was brewing across the Atlantic. Because tea was about to become much more than a drink. It was about to become a symbol of rebellion. By the 1770s, tea had become one of the most controversial drinks in the world. Not because it tasted bad, not because people were tired of it, but because it had become tangled up in politics. Across the Atlantic, Britain's American colonies were furious. The British government was imposing taxes on various goods, including tea. Many colonists believed this was unfair. After all, they had no representatives in the British Parliament making those decisions. Their complaint became famous. No taxation without representation. Tea suddenly wasn't just a beverage anymore. It was a political statement, a symbol, a protest waiting to happen. Then came the Tea Act of 1773. The British government hoped the new law would help sell more tea in the colonies. Instead, it made many colonists even angrier. And that anger reached its boiling point in the city of Boston. On a cold December night in 1773, a group of colonists boarded several ships carrying British tea. To avoid being recognized, many disguised themselves. Then they got to work. Not stealing the tea, not selling the tea, not even drinking the tea. They threw it into the harbor. Chest after chest after chest splashed into the water. By the end of the night, hundreds of tea chests had been destroyed. Some fish in Boston Harbor probably woke up the next morning wondering why the ocean suddenly tasted like breakfast. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. And despite the name, there was no tea party. No fancy cups, no biscuits, just a large-scale act of political protest involving an extraordinary amount of tea. The British government was furious. The colonists became more defiant. Tensions escalated. And before long, those tensions helped push Britain and the colonies toward war. It's one of history's strangest twists. A drink discovered thousands of years earlier in the mountains of China had somehow become part of the story that led to the birth of a new nation. Not bad for a leaf.
While tea was helping spark political revolutions in America, a much bigger problem was developing between Britain and China. The issue was simple. Britain loved Chinese tea. In fact, Britain loved Chinese tea so much that it was buying enormous quantities every year. There was just one problem. China wasn't particularly interested in buying many British products in return. So year after year, silver flowed out of Britain and into China. British merchants and politicians started to worry. Their favorite drink was becoming an expensive national habit. They needed a solution. And unfortunately, the solution they chose would become one of the darkest chapters in tea history. Britain began selling opium to Chinese traders. Opium was highly addictive, and demand grew rapidly. Soon, silver started flowing back toward Britain. From a business perspective, the plan worked. From a human perspective, it was a disaster. Millions of people became addicted. Chinese officials became increasingly alarmed. Eventually, the Chinese government decided enough was enough. They moved to stop the opium trade and confiscated large quantities of the drug. Britain responded with military force. The result was the First Opium War in 1839. And yes, one of the major reasons behind the conflict was Britain's desire to maintain access to Chinese tea and balance its trade. It's a strange and uncomfortable reality of history. A beverage that brought comfort and relaxation to millions of people was also connected to international conflict, economic pressure, and war. The fighting ended with Britain gaining significant advantages in trade and influence. China was forced to make concessions it never wanted to make. The balance of power in the region changed dramatically. And all of this happened because one side desperately wanted tea and the other side controlled most of the world's supply. It's a reminder that tea wasn't just a drink anymore. It had become a global economic force.
By the mid-1800s, Britain had a problem. The country was drinking enormous amounts of tea, but almost all of that tea still came from China. That meant China controlled the plants, the growing techniques, the processing methods, and the knowledge needed to produce high-quality tea. Britain wanted independence from that system. there was just one issue. China wasn't exactly handing out tea secrets for free. So Britain turned to a man named Robert Fortune. And what happened next sounds less like history and more like the plot of a spy movie. Fortune was a botanist, basically a plant expert. In 1848, he was sent on a mission to learn everything he could about China's tea industry. He traveled through regions that were largely closed to foreigners. He disguised himself in local clothing. He visited tea-growing areas. He observed how tea was cultivated and processed. And most importantly, he collected tea plants and seeds. Lots of them. Imagine being hired by your government to secretly copy an entire industry. That's essentially what was happening. Fortune didn't just bring back tea plants. He also brought back knowledge. How to grow tea, how to harvest it, how to process the leaves, how to produce the varieties people loved drinking. The plants and expertise were transported to British-controlled India. There, tea cultivation expanded rapidly. Soon, vast tea plantations appeared across regions such as Assam and Darjeeling. Workers planted, harvested, and processed millions of tea leaves. Before long, India was producing huge quantities of tea. Britain finally had an alternative source. China's monopoly was broken, and the global tea industry was transformed forever. Today, India is one of the world's largest tea producers, all because one botanist carried out one of history's most successful acts of industrial espionage. It's honestly one of the wildest stories in tea history. The world's favorite drink was no longer dependent on a single country. Tea had become truly global. And from this point forward, tea production would spread across multiple continents, reaching millions of new drinkers around the world. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, tea had completed an incredible journey. What began as a wild plant in ancient China had become a truly global beverage. Tea plantations were no longer limited to China and India. Countries such as Sri Lanka, Kenya, and many others were now producing enormous quantities of tea. For the first time in history, tea was being grown on multiple continents, and that changed everything. As production increased, tea became cheaper and more accessible. For thousands of years, tea had often been a luxury. Now ordinary people could enjoy it every day. Tea was no longer reserved for emperors, nobles, and wealthy merchants. It had become a drink for everyone. Then came another surprisingly important invention: the tea bag. According to popular accounts, tea bags became popular in the early 20th century after tea samples were accidentally used directly in hot water instead of being removed from their packaging. People discovered that brewing tea could be much faster and easier. Humanity had successfully found a way to make putting leaves in hot water even more convenient. Technology also transformed tea production. Machines helped process leaves faster. Railways transported tea across countries. Steamships carried it across oceans. Global trade networks became more efficient than ever before. Soon, tea was appearing in homes, cafes, offices, trains, hotels, and restaurants around the world. Different cultures adapted tea in their own ways. India developed chai. Britain embraced black tea. Japan refined matcha traditions. Other regions created countless local variations. The same plant was producing hundreds of different experiences. Today, billions of cups of tea are consumed every single day. People drink it hot, they drink it cold, they drink it with milk, with sugar, with spices, with lemon. Some people even spend 10 minutes deciding exactly how to make it. After nearly 5,000 years, tea continues to evolve. And that's pretty impressive for a leaf that accidentally fell into a pot of hot water. Tea had officially gone global. Before we finish, here are a few tea facts that sound completely made up, but they're actually true. For centuries, tea was so valuable that in some places it was treated almost like a luxury treasure. A small amount of tea could cost a surprising amount of money, making every cup feel like a very expensive decision. To transport tea faster, merchants built some of the fastest sailing ships in history.
These vessels, known as tea clippers, raced across oceans carrying precious cargo. Imagine an international speed competition powered entirely by people's impatience for tea. Then there's the Boston Tea Party. During that famous protest in 1773, more than 340 chests of tea were dumped into Boston Harbor. That's enough tea to make one very confused ocean. And here's perhaps the most impressive fact of all. Tea is the most consumed beverage in the world after water. Every single day, billions of cups are enjoyed across countless countries and cultures. Not bad for a plant that started its career as a random leaf in the mountains of ancient China. And some tea plants can live for more than 100 years. Think about that! There are tea plants alive today that are older than cars, airplanes, television, and probably your phone's battery life. From emperors and monks to merchants and revolutionaries, tea has traveled through thousands of years of human history. And somehow, after all that time, people are still looking at a handful of leaves and saying, "Yep, let's put that in hot water." Maybe that's the greatest achievement in tea history.